My name is Kristen Fox. I am with L Services. I'm the curriculum coordinating resource teacher. Before that, I was an English 2 and English 1 teacher at Independence for 18 years. And today we're going to be talking about white paper annotation. Hopefully everybody has a copy of the participant packet, and I'm going to do my best to kind of walk you through that packet. If you are by yourself watching this webinar, and you can possibly grab someone you love very much to come watch this with you and talk about the strategies, it works better when you've got a thought partner. This is my first time doing this as a webinar, so very excited about that. So looking at the first page of the participant packet, you will see that you have two texts on that first page, one right here and one right here. And I'm going to go ahead and just give you a couple minutes to annotate those two texts right there on the paper. All right, hopefully you had enough time to annotate those two texts. If not, feel free to hit pause and finish your annotation before jumping back in. So with those lovely folks around you, I would like to ask you to please talk about how you annotated those two texts and what challenges you had when annotating them, if you had any challenges at all. And again, I'll go ahead and give you a couple minutes to have that conversation, and then I'll jump back in. All right, if you're still in the middle of a great discussion, again, please feel free to hit pause and jump back in when you're ready. So when we're talking about annotation, perhaps some of your discussion was around the fact that it is challenging to annotate text when I don't know exactly what I'm annotating it for. Now, since I am talking to a group of science teachers, I am sure this first text was absolutely no problem for you. It's been a while with my ELA background since I have been asked to look at the bases. So for me, when I annotated that text, that is what my annotation looked like. I wasn't exactly sure what I was looking at. We have done this PD with folks who weren't even sure that that was a text. What I have loved is that the times that we've done this PD with science teachers and biology teachers, because that is your lens, you probably knew already what the question was going to be and maybe even what the answer is. But for me, this is where I am. The world history text, when I annotated that, I annotated it for the time period. I was looking at the setting. Because this was a personal diary entry, I definitely saw some bias. I was looking for, my conflict, my characters, looking for connotation, and again, looking for that genre. And maybe when you guys were having your conversations, some of your annotations also hit those pieces. But when I look at how I have annotated this text, I have annotated it through an English teacher's lens. Everything I was looking for are those things that I tend to always look for in an English text. So moving on, this was actually the question and the answer choices that accompanied that first piece of text. What is the complementary DNA strand? So hopefully looking at that question and looking at those answer choices helps with that annotation piece. And I have to be totally honest, when I was picking the text, I wasn't even sure what text on a biology test would need to be annotated. So I went to my 15-year-old who had just taken the biology EOC at that point and asked him which one of these would have helped you to annotate when you were annotating on the test, and he gave me that. And so if it was not the best choice, please forgive him. He does the best he can. For the world history text, you can see that we've got the question here, using the above excerpt, what conclusion can be made about the Glorious Revolution? And then you've got your answer choices there. So with those lovely folks around you, if you will please take just a couple minutes and have a conversation about what would have changed in your annotations if you had had the questions before I had asked you to annotate. And I'll give you guys just a couple minutes. All right. Again, if you're in the middle of a conversation and you're not ready to stop yet, please feel free to hit pause and rejoin when the conversation has finished. So we have done this PD with approximately 15 schools from elementary, middle to high schools. And the answer to this has pretty much been the same each time we've done it, that having that question definitely gives you a lens when you are reading that text. And each time I go to a school, it is really important to me personally that I say at some point that, even though we are talking about using white paper as an annotation strategy on a test, these overall skills that we're talking about are so much bigger than the test itself. We know that our kids are much more than a test score. But what we're really talking about when we're talking about these white paper annotation strategies is we're talking about teaching the kids how to read different disciplinary text and how to be strong readers in different disciplinary text. When I open a novel, I do not post-it note my novel to death. I just kind of climb inside my novel and I enjoy the ride. I love the characters. I hate the characters. However, when I'm skimming, educational articles on my phone, that's something that I probably do a lot more quickly. When I'm reading text, legal text, I know that I have to slow down, and sometimes I do have to make notes on that legal text if there is something that I'm not understanding, or I feel like I need to make connections. And those are the things that we do because we are strong readers. Our kids are still learning how to do that. That's a skill that they don't have yet. By way as an example, I don't know if any of you guys have done the Reader's Apprenticeship training, but there is a point in the Reader's Apprenticeship training, days 1 through 3, where they take one content teacher and pair that person with a person from outside the content. So I was ELA and I was paired with a math teacher, and we were both supposed to teach each other about our specific disciplinary text. So I walked him through a poem and looking at how the pronouns in the poem and changed how the reader saw the narrator, and then he gave me his page of text and asked me to annotate it. And I did. When I handed it back to him a few minutes later, it was filled with annotations. I looked for theme, main idea, repeated ideas, connotation. I looked for conflicting ideas. And he looked at me and asked what was missing from the equation. And my face went red because I didn't even realize that what I had just read was an equation. It didn't have the text features of a word problem. It was just a page of text. And it occurred to me, that was such an aha moment for me, because I thought, oh my goodness, this is how the kids feel. Because they don't come to us as these empty vessels. They come to us filled with all of these experiences and things they've learned from inside school and outside school, and yet sometimes we give them text and we don't prepare them to be successful for the questions that are going to be asked after that particular text. And we know from research that a kid who is embarrassed and humiliated shuts down for the next 20 minutes in class, and I can't afford in a 90-minute class to have my kids shutting down for 20 of those. So part of this, yes, is test-taking strategies, but the other piece of this is just helping our kids to learn what that lens looks like in a particular discipline. My experience with that math text would have been completely different if he, before giving me the text, had said, look for an equation. Now, as an English person, I'm not saying that I would have gotten the answer correct when he asked me, but I at least would have had a better shot because I would have known what I was looking for instead of looking for everything else. So, when we're talking about the test, we are talking about a specific type of text. And in one of the PDs that we did, we actually had a teacher who said that she was just recently graduated from college, and she said that she was actually specifically told by her professors not to show questions before reading the text. And you know what? Sometimes, yes. Sometimes I want to give kids a piece of text and have them do just some I wonders and some I knows and some I feels. I just want them to kind of enter the text very organically and have those conversations. But these assessments are a specific type of text, and this is not the kind of text that I want my kids going into organically. This is a different text, and so part of what we're doing is giving kids tools to read assessment text, and more specifically, assessment text in a digital environment. So we know currently these are the tools that are available for our kids on that online test. They have the ability to highlight, cross out their highlights. They have the ability to do what many call slash the trash, right? Get rid of those answers that are not correct. And they have the ability to flag those questions that, were kind of challenging for them. Maybe we're taking too much time so that they can come back to those later. What the kids tend to forget is that the other tools they have are that white paper and pencil that they're allowed to use on the test. These are tools that they know how to use in math, and they've been using these tools in math since they were in elementary school, but they don't necessarily know how to use these tools in different disciplines, in science and social studies and ELA, and that's where our job comes in. So the question becomes, why annotate it all on a digital test, right? If everything is moving digital, what is even the point of that annotation? And we're going to talk about the benefits for students, but also for us as teachers. This little shopping cart down here is there to remind me to tell you that I really want you to treat this webinar today like a trip through the grocery store, right? There are things that are going to work for your kids in your classroom. Take those off the shelf, put them in your cart, and I hope today that you leave with those. But I also know that the kids I taught in my content area and at my school are not the kids that you have in your classroom. And for those kids, just go ahead and leave those strategies on the shelf. Don't feel like everything that I am talking about today is something that you absolutely have to take. Take what works for you. If it doesn't work, just leave it. So when I go to PD, I really, the anecdotal stuff is nice, but I really like something that I can kind of sink my teeth into as far as research goes. So in your participant packets on the second page, on the back of the first page, you will see that you actually have a copy of these research studies. There is a lot of research that's coming out right now on the difference between note-taking digitally on a computer and note-taking by hand. And the two examples that we have today are from a study that was done in the University of California, but I know within the past couple weeks there was another one that just came out of New York that basically came to the same conclusion. So University of California, what they did is they basically were looking at which is more effective, note-taking by hand or note-taking on a computer. So they took a class, or two classes of kids in science, and one of the classes they said all of the notes that you're taking on what the professor is saying you need to take on the computer. The other class, they said every note that you take you're going to need to take by hand. And when they looked at those two different note-taking formats, what they noticed is that those kids who were typing their notes were pretty much typing everything verbatim. If it was coming out of the professor's mouth, then it was going straight into the computer. However, the kids who were taking their notes by hand were a lot more selective. They couldn't write as fast as the professor was speaking. So they had to summarize what the professor was saying. They had to paraphrase some ideas. They had to draw some symbols and make some connections and categorize. They had to stop and evaluate, is what he just said or she just said even something that I need to put in my notes? So those notes tended to be shorter and more selective. They gave both sets of classes the exact same assessment afterward, and what they noticed was for basic regurgitation of information, research, or recall information, both groups of kids did about the same. But when the questions were conceptual application, when they were questions that required analysis and inference and synthesis, the kids who took their notes on the computer did significantly worse. So the scientists kind of regrouped and asked themselves what happened. You know, what is the difference between that? And the conclusion that they basically came to was by processing the information, right, summarizing, paraphrasing, categorizing, evaluation, by processing that information when they were taking the notes, they were actually already practicing those skills, those conceptual application skills that they were going to get on that assessment. So the kids had already done that just in taking the notes the first time. Now, we know on these EOCs as they are now that the kids don't have an option of even typing annotation. So it's not an apples to apples comparison of what we're talking about, but I still think when we're talking about white paper annotation and kids doing annotating for a digital test, that there is still a big takeaway for our kids. So with those folks around you who you love and trust, I'm going to give you just a couple minutes to just have a brief conversation about what are the implications of this study? What do these studies mean for our students? All right, again, if you're still in the middle of a conversation, please feel free to hit pause and rejoin us when you're ready. So I have to say again, my background is ELA, and what I am going to do is kind of share our process as a PLC. English 2 and 8th grade science were the first 2 tests to go online. So our PLC, that first year that the English 2 tests went online, kind of had a panic moment. We had for years taught the kids really, strong strategies for annotating on the test itself. And so, we were wondering, what in the world are we going to do if the kids are taking this entire 4-hour text analysis assessment without being able to use any of those tools? So again, I'll remind you, please take what works for you and your kids, and feel free, if it doesn't work in your science classroom, to leave it on the shelf. So for us, again, this process started when we realized that the test was going online, and we all kind of thought, it's mean to take these tools away from these kids, knowing that these tools help them to be successful on these assessments. So for us, this is what a normal English 2 assessment would look like as far as the types of questions. As an English 2 teacher, I want my kids to know that 3, and there are actually 8 questions in this passage, but 3 out of the 8 questions are all dealing with structure. That's really important to me that they understand that, because there are a lot of other things that the test could be asking about when it asks about a text, but if 3 out of 8 of the questions are about structure, that is where their focus is. I want my kids to know that there's going to be a question about the supporters of Abraham Lincoln and why they were concerned about his safety. Now, for most kids, that's probably a question that they can answer without even reading the text. But for our L's, who perhaps don't even know who Abraham Lincoln is, much less what happened to him, that is something they really need to know is coming up as far as a question. I also really like my kids to know that there are specific text and word and phrase level questions coming up. That is a great place for them to actually use that highlighter tool. Before they even read the text, they can go in and make a note next to paragraph 6, make a note next to paragraph 12, knowing that, hey, I've got a question about this. I'm going to need to slow down a lot when I read these, because there is specific word level questions coming up. So again, our journey, our very first year of implementation of the white paper annotation, and you have a copy of this in your participant packet. It basically looked like a T-chart, a double entry journal, whatever it is that Cornell note format, whatever it is that you call it. What the kids would do is basically take the question, how does the author structure the text, and paraphrase it down the left-hand side of the page. I did not want them writing the whole question. Number 1, that's a waste of time. And number 2, again, if I know from research that copying things verbatim is not helping students process the information, then I don't want them copying that question word for word. I want to get a little double bang for my buck. I want to make sure that they're paraphrasing so they are forced to process the question and then later the text. So they would put their paraphrases of those questions down the left-hand side. I would actually have them physically draw arrows connecting the questions that were very similar. Chances are maybe questions 1 and 2 were very easy for them when they were answering them later on. Maybe question 3 was hard, but if those visual arrows are there, it's a reminder to them that question 3 and the answer to question 3 better sound a lot like what they put for question 1 and 2. Same with author's attitude and purpose. Those two are connected. Positive is positive, negative is negative. So those 2 questions need to sound similar. So then, after the kids had this left-hand piece on their paper, that little bar in the middle of the test between the text and the questions, we would have them slide that bar all the way to the right so that all they were looking at was the text itself. And then as they were reading the text, They would take notes, and again, we were very clear that these are not supposed to be answers. These are annotations. Some students wrote a lot. Some students just wrote maybe a word. Some students wrote, for maybe author's attitude, it was just a plus sign or a minus sign. And that's what they would put, so that when they actually finished the text, they would have this beautiful page of notes that they had taken the entire time, which when they then were looking at the answer choices, hopefully they would see that connection between what they had written down and that correct answer. Now, again, I know this is ELA and not biology, and for biology, the teachers that we have worked with, they have said that a lot of times for them in the white paper annotation, it's really more of a conversation about which kinds of questions need annotation, and then what would that annotation look like. A lot of our L teachers who are teaching biology said that for their kids, a lot of this over here on this right-hand side is pictures. So the question might be asking about a particular, a particular image that the kids need to see, a graph or some sort of structure, and then the kids just quickly sketch that there. For some of the kids, it's just kind of a quick translation for them of what that question is actually saying in maybe their native language. And so, what that's going to look like in your specific biology class could be very different, obviously, from what it looks like on this page. So, again, this is our journey. That was our first semester, and we practiced it with the kids. We, did the online assessment with the kids, and we were really pleased and, knew the kids were ready when they went into that EOC. It was a great place to start. What we saw on EOC day is that we only had about half of the kids actually using the annotation strategy. We never lied to the kids. We never told them they would count for a grade when they wouldn't count for a grade. But we kind of hoped that the kids had seen the value of those and would understand that that would be helpful for them. Obviously, we had not done a very good job of making that value clear to them. So as a PLC, we stopped and we regrouped and we asked ourselves, what can we do next semester to kind of help the kids see the value in these tools and strategies, because we know they help. So that second semester, there were a lot more discussions around reading strategies and examples. How do you specifically read text in this discipline best? So honestly, for some kids, visualizing was the tool that helped them the best. I had 2 girls in a standard level class who ended up getting 5s, and their annotations were just pictures. I'm not saying that works for every kid, but for these 2 girls, that was how they saw text the best, and it worked for them. Skimming subheads and graphics. Some kids really need to kind of get a feel for what that whole text is going to look like before they dig into the text. Notice and note signposts, repeated ideas, notice thinking about genre, and exploring varied styles of other students. Now, this notice thinking about genre piece on a different level might be very successful with biology. If the kids know what type of a question they're going into, then that kind of helps them set their lens before they even, start thinking about those answers. This last piece down here, exploring the varied styles of other students, was very successful, simply because what we would do is basically, after the kids had experimented for an entire semester about what their annotations looked like, they would, the day before the kids took the EOC, right, because nothing can happen after that. So the day before the kids would take the EOC, we would have the kids just kind of write down, what do your annotations look like? When you sit down to a passage, after this whole semester of experimenting, here's a sample passage, what do your annotations look like, and why did you kind of arrive at that annotation strategy? And that piece, we would then take those kids who, turned around and got 5s, we would cross out their names to protect their, scores and anonymity. And we would then turn around and pass that out to the next semester's kids so that they could see what all those different annotation styles looked like. And say, would any of these annotation strategies work for you, or does this give you an idea for something that might work for you? Now, I know this comes as a surprise to absolutely no one who has worked with teenagers, but as it turns out, they don't like being told what and how to do it. So that choice piece, giving them the ability to choose how they were going to annotate the test, that was the most powerful piece. And that had the highest impact. When we turned around that second semester, after giving them the ability to choose different annotation strategies, we had anywhere from 85 to 90% of kids in each class annotating. And again, they knew that it wasn't going to count, but because of these discussions and these conversations, they now understood the intrinsic value of those annotations and helping them with the test. So, in your participant packet, you have an example of annotation from our classes, and I'm going to give you again just a few minutes to look over those different annotation styles, and knowing that you are biology and yours is going to look a little bit different, have a conversation about what that might look like in your specific content. I'll give you guys just a couple minutes. All right, if you're still having a conversation, feel free again to pause the webinar and come back. So for the last piece, I do have to say that there was a lot of selling, especially at first, involved on our part as the teachers, because kids tend to come into white paper annotation and see it as just more work that they have to do. So we had a lot of intentional conversations about the fact that the very first semester that we did the English 2 EOC, before the kids were even annotating, because we didn't even know what the test was going to look like, that test took the kids 4 hours. When the kids use all of these annotation strategies with the white paper annotation, the test still takes 4 hours. The amount of time of the test doesn't change. What changes is where the kids are spending their time. So before the white paper annotation and before annotation, kids were spending their time flipping back and forth, right, between the text and the answer choices, kind of looking at which answer could possibly be correct. And we would tell the kids that, your strongest read of a text is when you're actually in the text the first time. So instead of spending your time there on the tail end, flipping back and forth to answer questions, you're spending your time before you even go into the text and while you're in the text, making sure that you're reading that text with a really intentional lens for what you're going to have to answer afterward. It's a better way to read the text, it's a smarter way to read the text, and it's more effective. That way, when they're looking at the answer choices, it's matching up with what they've already written on their paper, and so answering the questions actually moves a lot faster than it used to. We would give it value on assessments for annotation. We would make it a third of their grade on each of the assessments, and we would show both of those scores on the assessment. So the kids would be able to see, here was my 2/3 multiple choice grade, and here was my 1/3 annotation grade. We didn't have kids who were getting 100s on multiple choice and 20s on annotation. It just wasn't happening. So that piece was also very valuable for them because they could see the correlation between those two scores, and that helped them kind of begin to see how that process could benefit them. This next piece, feedback, was huge. And it did take a lot of feedback the first couple times that the kids were annotating on assessments. And we would only require the white paper annotation, in those practice assessments and on those actual assessments. This isn't something that we did every single day in class because we didn't want, we wanted to make the point that this is a strategy that is helpful for this particular type of text. So, but giving them that feedback, were they writing too much? Were they writing too little? Were they annotating, by basically answering the question instead of annotating by just kind of putting down notes? Were they, were they looking at the wrong piece? What is it about their annotations that was incorrect that we can help them improve for the next time? And what I didn't even realize until I started doing this, and was very interesting to me, is that the biggest feedback I was giving kids on their annotations was trust your annotations. Matter of fact, I even had to, start just using the acronym TYA on their assessments because I was writing it so many times. But what I found more than anything else is that when the kids were annotating the text, that first genuine time through the text, they were actually putting on their papers the correct answer. They were putting down the ideas from the text that would have led them to the right response, but they were turning around when they were looking at those answer choices and picking the distractor, the one that had, the sophisticated vocabulary, or that sounded the nicest, or that was the longest response, whatever it was that was luring them away from what they should have known was the correct answer. And that piece was really powerful because it's nice for me, the teacher, to know that the kids are picking the distractor answers, but it's really something I need them to know, and as soon as possible, because it's hard when you've kind of created this habit for yourself. And let's face it, by the time they get to us in the 9th and 10th grade, these kids have inculcated some pretty serious habits for these standardized tests. They've been taking them since 3rd grade, right? So it's hard for them to break that habit that they may have of picking the answer with the sophisticated vocabulary. But, they need to learn, trust me, right? Trust myself, trust what I wrote down on the paper, because I have seen in my previous assessments that I tend to be correct in my analysis of the text. And then finally, the student agency piece was huge, giving them the choice and kind of playing around with different ways of annotating, and them, on different assessments, seeing what worked for them, what didn't work for them. That piece was huge in selling it. And, it was interesting to me that my low-level foundations students tended to gravitate back to that double entry journal, that T-chart for their annotations. But on the EOC, they still did it. And they did it because it wasn't me telling them what to do. They did it because it was their choice. And a lot of my honors kids who had, were very strong test takers, typically, they really enjoyed the ability to kind of come up with their own creative way of annotating the text. So at this point, you can begin to, start thinking about and having conversations about what does this look like for your school and your students. And again, coming back to that shopping cart, I know that, my personal history with this is ELA. I know that there has been a lot of really amazing things going on in biology classes at Vance and at Independence as far as white paper annotation. If you have any questions, you are more than welcome to email me or email Kristen Baker. We both work with Curriculum Resources. with L Services, and I do have a resource folder link that has a link both to this whole PowerPoint presentation and to the participant packet. So if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. Thank you so much for giving us your time today, and we really hope that you were able to find something that will be valuable both for you and your students.